I want you to just, for a second, picture a room. It's large, lined with these mint green panels, and there's this low, constant hum of electronics.
The sound of a power plant.
Exactly. And the time is 1:23 and 40 seconds in the morning. The date is April 26, 1986. You're in the control room of Reactor Unit 4, northern Ukraine.
And by all accounts, the atmosphere was, well, it was almost boring. A routine test was just finishing up.
And a young man, just 25 years old, an operator named Leonid Toptunov, reaches out and presses a button. It's a big red button labeled AZ5.
AZ5, the emergency protection of the fifth category. In plain English, the scram button.
Right. It's the stop everything button. It's the emergency brake. You push this, a couple hundred control rods are supposed to plunge into the reactor core, kill the reaction, and everyone goes home.
That is what was supposed to happen.
But at that precise second, when his finger depressed that button, it didn't stop the machine. It detonated it.
And that single action, that split-second decision intended purely for safety, is what actually triggered the worst nuclear disaster in human history.
The ultimate irony, isn't it?
Yeah.
And today on this deep dive, we're going to unpack exactly how that happened. We're going to move way past the pop culture myths, the glowing monsters, and the simplified Hollywood timelines.
We have a pretty massive stack of sources here. Technical reports from the IAEA, declassified Soviet assessments, first-hand historical accounts of the cleanup crews, and this is crucial updates that go as recent as late 2025.
And that's important because this story is not a museum piece. It's still active. But first, we need to say just how significant this event was.
It's one of only 2 nuclear accidents ever rated as an INS Level 7. That's the highest possible rating on the International Nuclear Event Scale.
The other being Fukushima in 2011.
Exactly. But Chernobyl, it really stands alone in terms of the specific mechanics of the explosion and just the sheer scale of that initial radioactive release into the atmosphere.
So the mission for this deep dive is to get past that surface level. We want to understand the physics of the explosion. I mean, really understand it, not just throw around the buzzwords. We're going to look at the incredible heroism of the cleanup.
And the bizarre, almost science fiction-like ecological side effects that are still being studied today.
Right. And we'll bring it all the way up to the present because looking at news from just a few months ago, December 2025, the story of Chernobyl is very, very much still unfolding.
It really is. The site is a dynamic environment, both politically and physically. But to get a grip on where we are now with, damaged shelters and ongoing conflicts, we have to go back to that room, to that night.
So let's start there. The whole disaster was kicked off by a safety test. How does a safety test go so wrong?
Well, that's the tragic hook of the entire event. They were running an experiment to see if the massive steam turbine, as it was spinning down, could power the emergency cooling pumps during a total blackout.
Okay, so let's break that down. The power goes out, the reactor shuts down, but it's still incredibly hot. It needs water pumped through it to cool down.
Precisely. A nuclear reactor isn't like a light bulb you just switch off. It's more like a giant charcoal grill. Even after you stop feeding it fuel, the embers glow for a very, very long time. It produces something called decay heat.
And if you don't cool those embers,
a core melts, so you need a constant flow of water. Now, the plant had backup diesel generators for this. Huge, powerful engines.
But they take time to start up.
Right. There was about a 60 to 75-second gap. That's how long it took for those massive diesels to spool up and take the load. In the world of nuclear physics, 75 seconds without cooling is an eternity. It's more than enough time for the fuel to overheat and start melting.
So they needed a way to bridge that 1-minute gap.
Exactly. And the theory was actually quite clever. The steam turbine is this gigantic, heavy metal object spinning at thousands of RPM. It has incredible rotational momentum.
Like a massive flywheel.
A perfect analogy. So even if you cut the steam, it's going to keep spinning for a while just from its own inertia. They wanted to see if that dying spin, that spin down, could generate just enough electricity to run the main water pumps for that critical minute until the diesels kicked in.
It sounds like a smart idea.
Yeah.
It sounds like a vital safety feature.
It was a necessary one. In fact, to get the plant fully certified and signed off, they needed the system to work. And here's the thing. This wasn't the first time they'd tried this test.
Oh, really?
This was the 4th attempt. They had tried in 1982, 1984, and again in 1985. And it failed every single time.
Why did it keep failing?
The voltage from the spinning down turbine dropped off too quickly. The electrical field would collapse before that 60-second mark. The bridge wasn't long enough, so they had made some modifications to the voltage regulators, and this was attempt number 4. There was immense pressure from Moscow to get it done.
Okay, so they're under pressure. It's the 4th try. But here's the part that I just can't get my head around from reading the logs. To run this safety test, they had to disable the actual safety systems.
Yes. And this is where we start to see what safety experts call the Swiss cheese model of failure. You have all these layers of protection, like slices of Swiss cheese. A disaster only happens when, by chance, all the holes in all the slices line up perfectly.
But here they weren't lining up by chance. They were deliberately pushing them into alignment.
They were. To perform the test properly, they had to manually disable the emergency core cooling system, the ECCS.
Why on earth would they do that?
Because the test, if it worked, would naturally cause fluctuations in water flow and pressure. The automated safety systems are designed to detect exactly those kinds of fluctuations.
And they would assume it's a real emergency.
And flood the core with emergency water, shutting everything down and, from their perspective, ruining the test data. They didn't want the safety systems to interfere with their safety test.
So they were trying to test a new kind of safety net. But to do it, they had to completely remove the existing one. They were flying blind.
That's a perfect way to put it. But it gets worse because of the timing. The whole procedure, the shutdown and the test, was scheduled for the day shift on April 25th.
And the day shift were the experienced guys, right? The A-team.
They were the ones who had been prepped for this specific test. They knew the procedure inside and out. They started the process, began reducing the reactor's power, but then the phone rang.
The call from Kyiv.
A call from the regional power grid controller in Kyiv. Another power station somewhere else in Ukraine had unexpectedly gone offline.
And they were facing a power shortage.
A brownout. So the grid controller calls Chernobyl and essentially says, stop, we need your power. You cannot continue the shutdown. Hold at 50% power.
So the test is put on hold indefinitely.
For almost 9 hours. For 9 hours, the reactor just sits there, simmering at half power to keep the lights on in Kyiv. By the time they finally get the green light to resume the test, it's late.
And the day shift is long gone.
The day shift has gone home, the evening shift is packing up to leave, and the night shift is walking in completely cold.
And who's on this night shift?
You have Alexander Akimov as the shift supervisor, and the man who would eventually push the button, Leonid Toptunov, as the senior reactor control engineer.
And Toptunov.
Yeah.
We mentioned he was 25.
25 years old.
Yeah.
And according to the records, he'd only been in the senior engineer role for about 3 months.
Right.
So you have a young, very talented, but relatively inexperienced operator inheriting a complex, delayed test on a reactor that is now, because of that 9-hour delay, in a very strange and dangerous state.
Strange how. This brings us to what feels like the central villain of the physics part of the story. The xenon pit.
It absolutely is. You cannot understand Chernobyl without understanding reactor poisoning.
Okay, let's unpack this as simply as we can.
Think of a nuclear reactor like a very clean wood stove. The fuel is uranium. When the uranium atoms split, that's the burning. It creates heat, but it also creates byproducts.
Yeah.
Exactly. One of those byproducts is an isotope called iodine-135. Now, iodine-135 isn't the problem. The problem is that it decays, and it decays into xenon-135.
And xenon-135 is the problem.
It is the ultimate ash. Because it's a massive neutron poison. It is incredibly good at absorbing the free neutrons that are flying around the core.
And you need those neutrons to keep the chain reaction going.
You do. The xenon essentially suffocates the nuclear fire. It eats the neutrons and chokes the reaction.
So in normal operation, how do they deal with the xenon?
The reactor cleans itself. When it's running at full power, there's such an intense storm of neutrons inside the core that they burn away the xenon as fast as it's being created from the decaying iodine. It reaches a perfect equilibrium. The ash is burned away as it appears.
But they weren't at full power. They were at half power for 9 hours because of that call from Kyiv.
Precisely. At half power, you're still producing plenty of iodine, which is decaying into xenon, but you are not producing enough neutrons to burn that xenon away.
So the ash started to pile up.
The reactor was slowly, invisibly poisoning itself. It was choking.
So Toptunov and Akimov sit down at their consoles. The reactor is already in this compromised state. And then, shortly after midnight, as they try to lower the power to the test level of 700 megawatts, Something goes wrong.
Something goes very wrong. Toptunov makes a mistake with the controls. Some reports say it was an equipment glitch. It's still debated. But the result was that the reactor power just crashed.
How far?
It dropped to near zero, about 30 megawatts thermal. The reactor basically stalled. It flamed out.
And the test needed 700 megawatts.
Right. And at 30 megawatts, you are burning off practically zero xenon. In fact, you've now fallen into what operators call a xenon pit. The reactor is so thoroughly poisoned it doesn't want to restart.
And this is the moment. This is the big red flag. The operating manual, the safety regulations, they're all crystal clear on this point, right?
And unambiguous. The protocol states that if you fall into a xenon pit, you must shut the reactor down completely and wait. At least 24 hours. You have to wait for the xenon to naturally decay away on its own. You cannot fight it.
But they didn't do that.
They didn't. The deputy chief engineer, Anatoly Dyatlov, was in the control room overseeing the test. And Dyatlov was, by all accounts, a very abrasive, very demanding manager. He was determined to finish this test tonight. He basically bullied Akimov and Toptunov into getting the power back up.
But how can you do that if the reactor is choked with xenon poison? It's fighting you every step of the way.
So they had to fight back. The only tool they had to override the xenon poisoning was to pull out the control rods.
Okay, remind us what the control rods do.
They are the brakes. They're made of boron carbide, another neutron absorber. You insert them to slow the reaction down. You pull them out to speed it up.
So to counteract the xenon ash, they started pulling out the brakes.
They pulled them out. And then they pulled more out. And then more. They were essentially flooring the accelerator just to get the engine to idle.
How many are we talking about here?
There were 211 control rods in that reactor core. By the time they managed to stabilize the power at around 200 megawatts, which was still way below the 700 they needed, but Dyatlov decided it was good enough, they had withdrawn almost every single rod.
What was the safety limit?
The safety regulations required a minimum of 15 fully inserted equivalent control rods to be in the core at all times to maintain stability. Their own calculations later showed they were down to the equivalent of maybe 6 or 7.
So the brakes are gone. The safety margin is completely erased.
It's worse than that. The reactor is now a race car engine screaming at its red line, but the xenon is like a clogged exhaust pipe holding it back. It's this incredibly unstable hair trigger state. And it is in this state that they decide, at 01.23 and 4 seconds in the morning, to begin the safety test.
They start the test. They cut the steam flow to the turbine.
The turbine starts to spin down. The power to the main circulating pumps begins to decrease. The pumps slow down. The flow of cooling water through the reactor core slows down.
And this is where the fundamental design of the RBMK reactor becomes the final villain of the story, the positive void coefficient. We hear this term a lot, but what does it actually mean?
It is the RBMK's fatal flaw. In most reactors in the world, certainly in the West, water serves two purposes. It's a coolant, obviously, but it's also a moderator. It helps slow down neutrons to the right speed to cause fission.
Okay.
So in those reactors, if you lose water, if it boils into steam, you also lose your moderator, and the nuclear reaction slows down. It's an inherently safe design. It's called a negative void coefficient.
But the RBMK was different.
The RBMK used huge blocks of graphite as its moderator. The water was only there as a coolant and to absorb some stray neutrons.
So what happens when that water boils?
When the water turns to steam creating voids or bubbles, it becomes much less dense. And steam absorbs far, far fewer neutrons than liquid water does.
Which means there are more neutrons left flying around to split more atoms.
Which creates more heat.
Which boils more water.
Which creates more steam voids.
Which leaves even more neutrons free.
And it creates more heat. It's a runaway positive feedback loop, the exact opposite of a safe design.
A runaway train with no brakes.
Exactly. So back in the control room, the test begins. The pumps slow down. The water in the core starts to boil. Steam voids form at the bottom of the core. And because of the positive void coefficient, the reactor's power starts to creep up.
Akimov and the operators see this on their dials. They realize something is wrong.
The computer prints out a warning. Power is rising dangerously. Akimov shouts to press the AZ5 button, and at 01.23 and 40 seconds, Toptunov presses it.
The scram, the emergency shutdown, the one action that was supposed to save him. Why did pressing the stop button cause the explosion?
Because of one last catastrophic design flaw in the control rods themselves. This is known as the graphite tip effect.
The tips of the rods were made of graphite.
Yes. The main body of the rod was boron carbide, the neutron absorber, the brake. But the bottom 4.5 meters of each rod had a graphite tip, and at the top there was a section of hollow channel filled with water. The graphite was there as a displacer.
What does that mean?
The designers put it there for, well, for what they thought were good reasons. It was meant to improve neutron economy during normal operation. When the rod was fully withdrawn, the graphite displacer filled the channel, preventing the cooling water, which absorbs some neutrons, from filling the space. It made the reactor slightly more efficient.
But they never considered what would happen during an emergency shutdown from a fully withdrawn state.
Exactly. So imagine the situation. The rods are almost all the way out of the core. The empty channels below them are filled with water. The operators press AZ5. All 200-plus rods start moving down into the core at once.
And the first thing that enters the active zone isn't the boron break.
It's the 4.5-meter-long graphite tip. And what does graphite do? It's a moderator. It increases reactivity. So as the rods enter the core, they first displace the neutron-absorbing water in the lower part of the core with neutron-moderating graphite.
So for a split second, instead of hitting the brakes, they floored the accelerator.
In the part of the reactor that was already starting to run away, that sudden, massive injection of positive reactivity at the bottom of the core was the final trigger.
The power surge must have been instantaneous.
The sources say it went from 200 megawatts to possibly over 30,000 megawatts thermal, 10 times the reactor's maximum design output in less than a second.
What does that kind of power surge do to a reactor?
It's not a meltdown, it's an obliteration. The nuclear fuel didn't just melt, the energy was so intense it shattered. The fuel rods fragmented and exploded, flashing the surrounding cooling water into a massive burst of high-pressure steam.
And that was the first explosion.
That was the first blast, a colossal steam explosion that blew the 1,000-ton steel and concrete biological shield, the lid of the reactor, they called it, Elena, straight up through the roof of the building.
1,000 tons.
Yeah.
Just tossed into the air like a coin.
Like a coin. But it wasn't over. Just a few seconds later, there was a second, even larger explosion. And the nature of this one is still debated.
Sources mentioned a couple of theories. Hydrogen explosion.
That was the initial Soviet explanation. That the extreme heat of the first explosion dissociated water into hydrogen and oxygen, which then detonated. It's plausible.
But there's another, more terrifying theory. The nuclear fizzle.
Yes. More recent analysis, including a prominent 2017 study by Swedish researchers, suggests that the second blast might have been a small, prompt criticality event.
You mean a nuclear explosion?
Essentially, yes. A very, very inefficient and dirty nuclear detonation on the order of a few hundred tons of TNT. The first steam explosion basically blew the fuel into a configuration that, for a microsecond, went critical like a nuclear weapon.
That is just horrifying. And it lines up with some of the eyewitness accounts, right? There was a worker, Alexander Yevchenko, who was in the building. He looked up through the destroyed roof.
And he described seeing a beautiful laser-like beam of pure blue light shooting up from the reactor core into infinity.
What was that?
That was ionized air. The column of radiation screaming out of the exposed core was so unbelievably intense that it was stripping the electrons off the atoms in the air, causing the nitrogen and oxygen to glow with that eerie blue light. It was the color of death.
So the reactor is open, the core is on fire, spewing radioactive particles into the night sky. And the first people to arrive on this apocalyptic scene are the local firefighters.
Lieutenant Volodymyr Previk's brigade from the power plant's own fire station, they were on the scene within minutes.
And these guys, I mean, reading their accounts is just heartbreaking. They get the call, they arrive, and they think it's just a fire.
They thought it was a standard electrical fire on the roof of the turbine hall, which was adjacent to the reactor building. Their training was for fighting fires, not for radiological disasters. There was no protocol telling them, if the reactor building roof is gone, do not approach.
The driver of one of the fire engines, a man named Grigory Kemmel, described seeing chunks of material scattered all over the ground.
Graphite. Hot, glowing chunks of graphite from the reactor's moderator.
And they were just kicking it out of the way.
Picking it up. One of them reportedly said, "It's hot," and tossed it. They were handling pieces of the reactor core with their bare hands, clearing it out of the way to get their hoses closer.
And the symptoms of radiation poisoning started almost immediately?
Yes. Many of them described it. A metallic taste in the mouth. That is a classic, terrifying sign of massive radiation exposure.
And a feeling of pins and needles on their faces.
Yes, like a sunburn. But it wasn't heat. That was hard gamma radiation, literally burning their skin and destroying the nerve endings. They were doomed from the moment they arrived.
Meanwhile, back inside the shattered control room, there is this profound state of denial. Akimov, the shift supervisor, He just could not process what had happened.
It's partly a psychological defense mechanism. The event was simply inconceivable, but it was also a catastrophic failure of instrumentation.
The dosimeters, the radiation detectors.
Most of the dosimeters they had access to were designed to measure low-level radiation from minor leaks. They had a maximum reading.
And that reading was 3.6 roentgens per hour. The famous line from the HBO series, not great, not terrible, it was based on that reality.
It was absolutely real. They sent a trainee out with a dosimeter. He came back and said it's 3.6. And they believed him because the meter couldn't display anything higher. The actual radiation levels in some parts of the plant were closer to 20,000 roentgens per hour.
20,000. What's a lethal dose?
A dose of around 500 roentgens over 5 hours is fatal for about half the people who receive it. 20,000 roentgens per hour is a death sentence in minutes.
But because Akimov saw 3.6, and because he had been taught his entire career that an RBMK reactor could not physically explode, his brain came to the only conclusion it could.
That the reactor was intact, and that a hydrogen tank had exploded nearby, causing the fire. He was convinced the core was still there and just needed to be cooled.
And so he kept sending his men to their deaths.
He did, and he went himself. He and his crew, including Toptunov, stayed at their posts until morning, trying to manually open valves to pump emergency cooling water into a reactor that no longer existed. They were wading through radioactive water in the dark, trying to do their duty.
And all of them, Akimov included, died horrific deaths from acute radiation syndrome within a few weeks.
Yes, it's this awful picture of bravery completely misapplied because of denial and failed equipment.
So while this is happening, the sun starts to come up on Saturday morning, and the nearby city of Pripyat, the beautiful modern city built for the plant workers, wakes up.
And this is where the disaster moves from a technical failure to a failure of crisis management, a failure of the state.
The evacuation delay, it took them 36 hours to start moving people out of Pripyat.
36 hours. Life in the city just continued.
Yeah.
It was a beautiful spring day. There were 16 weddings scheduled in Pripyat that Saturday. Kids were playing in the streets. People were fishing in the river that was used as a cooling pond for the plant.
And they could see the smoke coming from the reactor. But nobody told them anything.
Nothing. In fact, the state's first instinct was to hide it. We have this incredible account from Valentina Shevchenko, a high-ranking Ukrainian official at the time. She called Moscow, desperate for information. She asked, "What is happening? How are the people?"
And the reply from Moscow was,
The official on the line told her, "Don't worry. Everything is fine. People are gardening."
people are gardening. While a nuclear core is burning a few kilometers away, the priority was controlling the narrative, not protecting the people.
And they might have kept it quiet for longer, if not for Sweden.
Right. How did Sweden figure it out?
On the morning of Monday, April 28th, workers arriving for their shift at the Forsmark nuclear power plant in Sweden, over 1,000 kilometers away, started setting off the radiation alarms.
They thought their own plant was leaking.
They did. They went into lockdown, checked everything. The plant was clean. It wasn't them. So they started analyzing the radioactive particles on the workers' shoes. They identified isotopes that were characteristic of a Soviet RBMK reactor. They checked the wind patterns.
And the trail led right back to Chernobyl.
Sweden confronted the Soviet Union with the evidence, and only then, faced with irrefutable proof from the outside world, did the Kremlin finally admit to the world that an accident had occurred.
By which time, they had finally started the evacuation of Pripyat. The buses rolled in on Sunday afternoon.
About 1,200 buses. Residents were told over the loudspeaker to pack essentials for just 3 days. It is a temporary measure, they said.
They never came back.
They never came back. But back at the site, even as the scale of the disaster was becoming clear, a new, even more terrifying threat was emerging.
The Suicide Squad.
Yes, the 3 divers. This is one of the most famous stories to come out of Chernobyl and also one of the most heavily mythologized.
So let's set the scene. The burning reactor core, this molten mass of fuel and sand and concrete they called corium, was melting through the concrete floor beneath the reactor.
And directly below that floor were the bubbler pools, huge reservoirs containing thousands of tons of water, part of the plant's pressure suppression system.
And if that molten lava-like corium hit that water,
The result would have been a cataclysmic thermal explosion. A steam explosion so massive it would have vaporized the rest of the reactor building, ejected the remaining fuel high into the atmosphere, and spread deadly fallout across most of Europe. Some scientists estimated it could have rendered half of Europe uninhabitable for centuries.
they had to drain those pools.
Immediately. But the valves to drain them were located in a flooded, pitch-black corridor underneath the reactor. They needed volunteers.
And 3 men stepped forward. Ananenko, Bespalov, and Baranov. One knew where the valves were, the other two were there to help and hold the lights. They volunteered to wade into that lethally radioactive water to open the sluice gates.
And the popular legend, the story that has been told for decades, is that they were heroes who saved Europe, completed their mission, and then died from horrific radiation sickness just a few days or weeks later.
But our sources, the more recent declassified information, tell a different story.
It's a crucial myth-busting moment. They were absolutely heroes. What they did was unimaginably brave. They went into that water knowing it could kill them, but they did not die days later.
All three of them survived the immediate aftermath.
They did. They suffered from radiation sickness, yes, but they recovered. In fact, in 2018, the Ukrainian government awarded all three of them the Order for Courage.
Wait, in 2018, they were still alive.
Two of them, Ananenko and Bespalov, were still alive to receive the awards. Baranov had passed away in 2005, but from heart failure, nearly 20 years after the disaster. It's an incredible story of survival that gets lost in the more dramatic but incorrect myth.
That is mind-blowing. It doesn't diminish their heroism at all. In fact, it makes it more real.
I agree. It shows that they were prepared to be martyrs, but they were fortunate enough to survive.
Okay, what about another famous group from the cleanup? The miners. The ones who dug a tunnel under the reactor.
Yes, this was to combat another threat, the China syndrome. That was the fear that even if the steam explosion was averted, the corrosion would just keep melting downwards through the concrete foundation and into the groundwater.
And if it hit the groundwater, it would poison the entire Dnieper River system.
Which was the water supply for Kyiv and millions of people downstream. It would have been an ecological catastrophe of a different kind. So they called in coal miners from the Donbass region.
And they were tasked with digging a tunnel under the still-burning reactor.
A 150-meter tunnel to excavate a chamber where they could install a massive heat exchanger, a cooling system, to freeze the ground and stop the meltdown.
The conditions must have been hellish.
Unimaginable. The temperature in the tunnel was over 50 degrees Celsius, or 122 Fahrenheit, plus the radiation. The miners often worked naked or just in shorts because it was simply too hot to wear any protective gear. They dug that tunnel in just over a month.
An incredible feat of engineering and endurance. Did the cooling system work?
Here's another irony. The cooling system was never actually used.
Why not?
By the time they finished the tunnel and were ready to install the machinery, they realized the corium had started melting on its own. It had cooled and solidified before it reached the foundation, so the miners risked everything for a solution that, in the end, wasn't needed.
But they didn't know that at the time?
They didn't know. They did what they were told to save millions of lives, and the concrete they poured into that chamber did help stabilize the foundation for the next phase.
Which was building the sarcophagus,
Mm-hmm.
the giant concrete shell to entomb the reactor. But to do that, they first had to clean the roof.
The roof cleanup is probably the most iconic and horrifying image of the entire Chernobyl disaster.
Mm-hmm.
The explosions had showered the roofs of the adjacent buildings with chunks of the reactor core, graphite blocks, fuel assemblies.
Some of the most radioactive material on Earth.
And it had to be cleared before they could safely bring in the cranes and construction workers to build the sarcophagus.
Their first idea was to use robots, right?
It was. It seems like the logical solution. They brought in Soviet lunar rovers, remote-controlled bulldozers. They even bought a high-tech police robot from West Germany called Joker.
And what happened?
The radiation destroyed them. The intense gamma rays fried their electronic circuits. The robots would drive out onto the roof, jerk around for a few minutes, and then just die. Valery Legasov, the lead scientist, famously said, "The robot ceased to be a robot."
So when technology failed, they turned to biorobots.
A chilling euphemism for human beings, mostly young military reservists who were called up.
What was their job?
They were given makeshift lead armor-crewed sheets of lead strapped to their chests and groins. They were handed a shovel, and the order was, run out onto the roof, shovel one load of debris over the edge into the reactor crater, and run back.
How much time did they have out there?
It varied, but typically between 40 and 90 seconds. That was it. In that minute and a half, they could absorb a lifetime's recommended dose of radiation.
And how many men did this?
The records show that 3,828 of these biorobots were used to clear the roof. They did what the multi-million-dollar robots could not.
It's just unimaginable courage. And that brings us, grimly, to the human cost, the health impact. This is where the numbers seem to get very fuzzy and very controversial.
It is the most debated part of the legacy. Let's start with what we know for a fact. We know that 28 people, firefighters and plant workers, died from acute radiation syndrome, or ARS, within the first 3 months. Another 3 died from other immediate causes.
Okay, so that's the direct short-term death toll. But what about the long-term effects? The first thing everyone talks about is thyroid cancer.
That is the most significant, scientifically proven long-term health impact of the disaster. One of the main isotopes released was iodine-131.
It has a short half-life, right? Only about 8 days.
Right. But in those first few weeks, it gets into the atmosphere, it falls on the grass, cows eat the grass, the radioactive iodine concentrates in their milk, and then people, especially children, drink the milk.
And iodine naturally accumulates in the thyroid gland.
Exactly. And because children's thyroids are smaller and more active, they received massive doses. The result was an epidemic of thyroid cancer in children and adolescents across Ukraine, Belarus, and parts of Russia.
How many cases are we talking about?
The UN Scientific Committee estimates over 6,000 cases can be directly attributed to Chernobyl radiation exposure. The good news, if you can call it that, is that thyroid cancer is highly treatable. The survival rate is well over 99%.
But then we get into the murkier statistics, the total death toll. You see figures that range from the official UN estimate of around 4,000 eventual deaths from cancer among the most exposed populations.
All the way up to hugely disputed studies, sometimes cited by anti-nuclear groups, that claim numbers as high as 900,000. It's a massive range. And the truth is probably somewhere in the middle, but it's very difficult to prove definitively.
But there was another hidden health toll, wasn't there? Radiophobia, the fear itself.
This is a genuine and tragic part of the story. In the months and years after the accident, there was so much fear, so much misinformation and panic about the effects of radiation on pregnancy.
So what happened?
It led to a wave of what are called elective abortions. Across Europe, both East and West, an estimated 100,000 to 200,000 pregnancies were terminated because of fears of radiation-induced birth defects.
And was there any scientific basis for those fears?
Based on the actual doses received by the general population in Europe and on subsequent studies of pregnancies that were carried to term, there is no evidence of an increase in birth defects. The fear of radiation fueled by the media and a lack of clear information likely caused more terminated pregnancies than the radiation itself ever would have.
That's just a tragedy of a different sort. So let's pivot from the human cost to the environment. Because this is where the story gets really strange. You'd think the exclusion zone would be a dead, gray wasteland.
And in some ways it was, initially. But nature's response has been one of the most surprising outcomes. With humans gone, it has essentially become one of the largest nature reserves in Europe. Wildlife has returned in abundance. Wolves, boar, elk, even the rare Przalski's horse.
But it's not a normal nature reserve. The nature there is different.
It is. The most famous example is the Red Forest. This was a pine forest directly in the path of the worst fallout. The trees absorbed so much radiation that they turned this ghostly reddish-brown color and died.
So they just bulldozed the whole forest and buried it.
They did. But since then, new trees, new deciduous trees have grown back. Nature is reclaiming it.
And then there are the radioactive bores in Germany. This
Yeah.
detail is incredible.
It's a real problem that persists right up to today, 2025. In parts of Germany, particularly Bavaria, a significant percentage of the wild boar population still tests above the legal radiation limit for human consumption.
Why the boars specifically? Why not deer or other animals in the same forests?
It comes down to their diet. Boars love to eat mushrooms and truffles, especially a type of fungus called deer truffle, which they root for in the soil.
And the fungus acts like a sponge for radiation.
A perfect sponge for cesium-137, one of the long-lived isotopes from Chernobyl. The cesium fell on the forest, slowly leached deep into the soil over the decades, and these specific fungi are incredibly efficient at bioaccumulating it. The boars eat the fungi, and the cesium builds up in their bodies. It's a perfect, persistent loop of contamination.
That is wild. And speaking of fungi, this might be the most mind-bending piece of science to come out of the whole disaster. The radiotrophic fungi.
This is truly amazing. Researchers sent robots into the most dangerous parts of the ruined reactor, onto the walls of the reactor hall itself where radiation levels are still lethal, and they found it was covered in a thick black mold. A fungus.
And it wasn't just surviving the radiation.
No, it was growing towards the radiation sources. It was thriving. The species is called Cladosporium sphaerospermum, and scientists discovered something remarkable.
It's eating the radiation.
In a way, yes. It uses melanin, the same dark pigment that's in human skin, to perform a process called radiosynthesis. It converts the energy of gamma radiation directly into chemical energy for growth.
So like photosynthesis for plants with sunlight.
This is radiosynthesis for fungi with deadly radiation. It's using what should kill it as a food source. It's like something out of science fiction, but it's real.
It completely changes how you think about life. And deep in the basement of that reactor, there's another famous or infamous artifact, the elephant's foot.
The corium, that molten lava of fuel and sand that we talked about, it dripped and flowed down through the building until it came to rest in a steam corridor in the basement, where it solidified into this massive wrinkled shape that looks disturbingly like the foot of an elephant.
And it was one of the most radioactive objects on the planet.
In the 1980s, just 300 seconds of exposure to it would have been a lethal dose. It was so hard and dense that when they needed a sample for analysis, they had to have a soldier shoot it with an AK-47 to chip a piece off.
And what's happened to it since?
The latest reports from around 2021 indicate that it's starting to break down. The intense self-radiation and interaction with water is causing it to crumble. It's apparently softened to the consistency of coarse sand.
Which is a whole new problem for containment. This leads us to the legacy. The political fallout from Chernobyl was arguably just as significant as the radioactive fallout.
Oh, absolutely. Mikhail Gorbachev, the last leader of the Soviet Union, said in his memoirs that Chernobyl was perhaps the real cause of the collapse of the USSR.
That is a staggering claim from the man who was in charge.
His reasoning was that the disaster and the state's clumsy, secretive attempt to cover it up shattered the public's faith in the competence and honesty of the Soviet system. It was the ultimate test of his policy of glasnost, or openness.
And the system failed the test.
Spectacularly. You can't hide a radioactive cloud that's setting off alarms in Sweden. It forced the state's monopoly on information to break, and once that trust was broken, it could never be fully repaired.
And on a global scale, it completely changed the nuclear power industry.
It brought it to a halt for decades. Reactor construction projects were canceled all over the world. It led to the creation of the Convention on Early Notification of a Nuclear Accident. It fundamentally changed international safety protocols.
And bizarrely, it created a whole tourism industry.
Yes. In the 2010s, and especially after the HBO series in 2019, tourism to the exclusion zone exploded. You could take guided tours through Pripyat. It also spawned this subculture of stalkers, people who illegally hike into the zone to explore and camp out in the abandoned city.
A very strange phenomenon. But this brings us to the present day, because our sources have updates that go all the way through 2025, and the situation at the site has changed dramatically and dangerously.
It has. First, you have the new safe confinement, or NSC, that colossal metal arch that was slid over the top of the old crumbling sarcophagus in 2016.
An incredible feat of engineering.
Truly, it's the largest land-based movable structure ever built. It was designed to last for 100 years, to safely contain the reactor while it was dismantled from the inside. For a while, it seemed like the site was finally secure.
But then came the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022.
Right. In the very first days of the war, Russian forces captured the Chernobyl plant. Their soldiers famously dug trenches in the Red Forest, kicking up radioactive dust that had been undisturbed for decades. It was a major radiological disturbance.
But the most recent and alarming update in our sources comes from February 2025.
This is a critical development, and it hasn't received as much attention as it should. In February 2025, during the ongoing conflict, a Russian drone struck the new safe confinement.
It hit the arch directly.
It did. The strike caused a fire on the exterior and damaged the protective outer covering of the structure.
What was the assessment from the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA?
Their report as of December 2025 is grim. The IAEA declared that due to the damage, the structure has now lost its primary safety functions.
Lost its primary safety functions. What does that mean exactly?
It means its ability to act as a sealed container for the radioactive dust and particles inside is now compromised. The main load-bearing structures are apparently still sound, so it's not in immediate danger of collapse. But the seal is broken. We are back in a situation where the containment of that incredibly dangerous material is no longer guaranteed.
It's just terrifying to think that nearly 40 years later, this site is still an active threat, now complicated by war.
It's the ultimate lesson of Chernobyl. A nuclear disaster doesn't have an end date. The half-life of plutonium-239, one of the elements in that core, is over 24,000 years. Regimes fall, borders change, wars are fought, but the radioactivity remains.
So when we zoom out and try to take it all in, what's the big takeaway?
I think Chernobyl taught us that the greatest danger isn't just the splitting of the atom, it's the intersection of complex technology with human fallibility, with secrecy, with pride, with bureaucracy, and with fear. The reactor didn't explode just because of a positive void coefficient. It exploded because it existed within a political culture where production quotas were more important than safety protocols.
And on the flip side, it also taught us about the shocking resilience of nature.
Yes. The fact that the zone is green again, that wildlife is thriving, and that fungi have literally evolved to eat the radiation. It's a very humbling reminder. We can create environments that are completely uninhabitable for us, but life finds a way to adapt.
And that actually brings us to our final thought. We tend to think of the exclusion zone as a dead zone, a wound on the face of the Earth, a warning.
That's certainly the common perception.
But when you look at that radiotrophic fungus, the one that's thriving on the very thing that's most deadly to us, maybe we're looking at it the wrong way. Maybe it's not a dead zone. Maybe it's a preview.
A preview of what?
A preview of a post-human evolution. If we ever succeed in making this planet truly toxic for ourselves, we now have evidence that there are organisms ready to take over. They are already adapting to feed on the very waste that we create and cannot control. The zone isn't empty. Maybe it's just the next chapter, a chapter that's moving on without us.
That is a very provocative thought and a deeply humbling one.
Thanks for listening to this deep dive. It's a heavy, complex story, but understanding exactly how things went so wrong is the only way we can hope to prevent it from happening again.
Stay curious and always question the safety of the safety test.
See you next time.